Okay, this is the second week of our little midterm review session. Before I launch into the lecture for this week, let me just tell you how the rest of the term is going to go. Next week, we will start the poetry section, and that begins on page 488 in McMahon. This will be exactly the same in the way it proceeds as the short story section. You'll be asked to read a bunch of poems, think about the way they work, think about things like structure and theme and other things that will be added to the study of poetry. Then you'll write a little reflective piece the first week. The second week you'll write a little analytical piece using one poem and applying the elements that we've learned in the poetry unit. And then the last 2 weeks you'll draft and write a larger essay, which will be peer-reviewed and so forth. So the poetry unit is a 4-week unit that follows exactly the same organization as the short story unit. And then you'll have a novel project going in the background. When we finish the poetry unit, we should have some time left to work just on the novel unit. So for the 1/3 of you who haven't yet even picked a novel, you need to get with the program like yesterday. And let me remind you again, I don't have any way of knowing when anything is posted in your novel groups. So if you're using the novel groups, I'd like to try to help you and guide you and provide resources for you. But if you put anything up in the novel group that you're in, you're going to have to send me an email to let me know that there's something there. Otherwise, I've got to go and open all 14 of them, and that's just not going to happen. Unfortunately, Canvas hasn't figured that out yet, so I am not automatically notified when a student puts anything up in the novel groups discussion boards, and so you're going to have to let me know, and then I'll pop in there and see how I can help and advise, and in other ways talk about that with you. So this last week of our little review unit, if you notice, the name of this class is Argumentation, and if you notice the syllabus, you're supposed to get a little bit of an introduction to logical fallacies and how reasoning works. And we simply use literature to teach the reasoning. So let me first talk about induction. We did a little piece last week on induction, and I want to make induction as distinct from deduction. Induction is evidence-based. So you look at the evidence in a story and you draw a conclusion and you say, this is my evidence and here's the conclusion I draw. Induction is what is called the scientific method. Induction is based on evidence that you present and then draw a conclusion. Deduction, on the other hand, works something like the other way around. And the reason that I gave you the little On Bullshit book at the beginning of term to read is that it's a classic example of deduction. Deduction starts with general principles to which agreement is assumed, and then you proceed from that point of agreement to discuss the issues. If you open up the Frankfurt book and you look at the very first 2 sentences, one of the most salient features of our culture is that there is so much bullshit. Everyone knows this, period. That's a classic example of a deductive formula in which it's going to be based on logic rather than evidence. And so you wouldn't expect a lot of inductive evidence in the Frankfurt piece. You'd expect deduction, you'd expect logical analysis. Another classic example of deduction is the formula, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Truths, self-evident, everybody accepts this. That's deduction. In other words, if you're asked to accept a conclusion that makes sense and you're asked to accept it in the absence of evidence, and then the argument goes on and pursues, then that's deduction. Now, the next thing that we need to talk about is the idea of logical validity and invalidity. But let me first say that the kind of papers you're writing for a class like this, they're primarily induction. They're primarily taking evidence out of the story and then coming to a conclusion and presenting that evidence. So one of the discussions this week is about logical fallacies. I'm just going to put a little video up there for you. The discussion of logical fallacies and the way they get used and abused in our culture could be the work of an entire course. Of course, we don't have time for that, so I'm going to put up a little video and have you talk about the kinds of fallacies that you may see in your everyday lives. A logical fallacy is a mistake in reasoning. And so the reason we learn to recognize them is that they're used against us quite often in our culture. And so if I recognize the kind of fallacy that's being used against me, I have some weapon to combat it. If I don't know what's going on, I'm literally clueless. There's only one that we're really going to worry about, and that's what's called a hasty generalization or a rush to judgment, and that is arriving at a conclusion without sufficient amounts of evidence to make the conclusion a reasonable one. And we're going to define what is a reasonable amount of evidence for our purposes. This is not going to be true for every situation you'll encounter, but 3 pieces of evidence should be sufficient to avoid the charge of a hasty generalization, to provide a reasonable, logical conclusion to the evidence which you've presented. So when I grade papers, I'm looking for 3 pieces of evidence that lead to the conclusion. On the other hand, if you just say, well, this is a thing because I say it is, that's inviting me to deductive reasoning, and I might accept what you say, but you'd get there in a different way. And certainly just because you or I say so may look like deductive reasoning, but it isn't valid deductive reasoning. One must provide evidence for one's belief system in academic writing. And typically, as I said, it'll be induction. You'll say, here are the pieces of evidence, here's my conclusion, and here's why my conclusion makes sense. And that leads me to the next little bit of this lecture, and that is about validity and invalidity. We use the words true and valid more or less interchangeably. If I say that something is valid, I'm also saying it's true. If I say that something is true, I'm also saying that the argument that supports it is a valid argument. Well, that's not really right. Truth and validity are not exactly the same thing. Truth may have reference to larger concepts, larger ideals. Truth may not be a thing that is measurable using logical formulas. In some cases it is, but not always. Validity is measurable by logic. So we want to be careful about using truth and validity or untruth and invalidity interchangeably. They're not the same thing. And there's going to be a little exercise in the forum in which we'll reason our way through to figuring out what the difference is. I'm not going to tell you because the exercise this week will, I think, lead us to the conclusion and the discussion that we'll be able to figure out. But be careful in saying that an argument is valid. Just remember that it's not the same as saying an argument is true, nor is saying an argument is true not necessarily the same thing as saying an argument is valid. When an argument is valid, it is logically sound, meaning you've either presented a sufficient amount of evidence, thus avoiding the hasty generalization in induction, or you started with a general principle to which everybody, or at least most rational people, will agree, and then you proceed from that, which is deduction. The difference is not that hard to understand if you really look at the way the argument works. And of course you have to understand how the argument works to figure out what kind of an argument you're looking at. So there will be a discussion about that in the forums this week. I'm putting up 2 papers by your colleagues that I thought were particularly good. I'm working on finishing up your big essay that you turned in a couple of weeks ago, and I'll have those done within a few days. But there were two that I thought were particularly good, and I'm going to put those up for you to look at with my comments on them so you can see why I thought they were particularly good. Now, there's a danger in this. It's always a bad idea to compare yourself to somebody else in your class or your world or whatever. Comparing you to somebody else doesn't really go anywhere. I'm not presenting these papers to you for you to think, oh, I should write like this. I'm giving you these papers to say, here is a person who took the task, did it really well, and completed it effectively. You shouldn't compare yourself to that person, but what you should compare yourself to is the person who has learned all of the principles of this class, and there's been a lot of stuff that you've learned. If you follow those principles, your writing will be better than if you don't. That's guaranteed. So don't compare yourself to these two papers that I put up. Just look at them and say, well, there's a really good example of one person who did it well. But the thing to compare is, am I following the principles? Am I applying the logic? When Acree says go and review the topic, sentence, thesis, titles, all that stuff that I put up there, when Acree says go review that, do I actually go review it? Do I practice it? Do I try to get better? Or do I ignore Acree's advice? So you following the principles and you not following the principles, that's the two people you should compare. You not following and you following. You following the principles will be better, guaranteed, and most likely your grade will go up. So compare you now to you, the perfect you who might follow all the principles and something in between. I don't want you to feel intimidated by these two papers. They're quite good, but I'm not suggesting that you imitate them. I'm suggesting you take the same approach in your own way, applying the principles, and you'll be surprised at how good your writing gets quickly. On the other hand, some of the papers were not very good at all, and it's time for those folks to step up to the plate and start sort of getting with the program, if you're going to at all. If you're happy with where you are, then that's where you are, and it's not for me to judge in any way. But if you want to make a change for the better, if you need to make a change for better, and if you want to make a change for the better, now's the time to step up to the plate and follow my recommendations, not because I'm God in heaven, but because I'm a teacher of writing. I know what I'm doing, been doing it a long time. I know what I'm doing. And so the advice I give you is good advice, which you can follow. And then, so there are going to be two of those discussions, just general kind of talking about the paper. And then I'm going to put up another paper that has some issues with certain parts of it, and I want you to talk about the thesis statement and how that thesis statement gets worked out, and how that thesis statement could have gotten worked out better, more effectively, with probably less labor on the part of the student. I'm still writing way too many times. Please go check that thesis statement resource that I provided for you. So part of that discussion is going to be looking at that little PowerPoint, because I'm getting a fairly strong feeling that a lot of folks are not. And so the light isn't going on for you. Now, I understand that this is not stuff that you should be learning in this class. This is stuff that should have been learned in the previous class, English 1A, but sometimes it doesn't work that way, and sometimes people forget. And so I need to review that one more time for you, because there are just too many people who are still kind of floundering, who could get an awful lot better, an awful lot quicker, just by paying attention to that thesis statement. Okay, so that's the lecture for this week. There are odds and ends of things to do in the discussion. There's no formal writing to do. If you want to start working on the next unit, start reading the poetry section. If you want to start working on the writing for that, look back at the short story section and see what you were asked to do in that first short assignment, that meditative piece, and then know that that's the first thing we're going to do with poetry, and that'll be coming not this week but next week. So if you want to work ahead, that's what you should be doing. Prepare yourself for what's coming in the poetry unit, or get some work done on your novel, or both, or neither, whatever suits you and your time constraints. Okay, I hope you have a wonderful week. We're closing in on the end of it already. It won't be long now. Bye.